Hi 451 folks. This is our content for the week. Since we didn't meet last night, this is Wednesday afternoon, about 3:30, that I'm finally getting to record this. This is our crisis communication content. I will have another video for you that will be a lot shorter, that will be about starting our feature stories. You won't have an assignment due for that this week. You will have a crisis communication related assignment. So heads up on that. And then the other thing I want to let you know in this video, there are several links and videos that I want you to watch. I'm not going to pull them up and have you watch them in this video, but there will be links in the slides here, and I will pull those out of the slides and put them in our regular modules page as well so that you can watch those at your leisure. The other thing I'm going to make sure to do is in addition to the video and these slides, I'm going to make the slides available to you as well. So you'll be able to watch the video where I go through the slides, you'll be able to access the slides yourself, and then you'll be able to access the links either in the slide presentation or outside of it in the modules content area. So I just want to let you know that before I get started here. I'm going to go through this material pretty quickly because you had a little bit of crisis communication, and then you had a second chapter or a chapter to read for today. And because we didn't meet, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I do want you to have the experience and the information related to this topic. Also, some of the news and media relations things that we talked about when we talked about press conferences, news conferences, pertain here as well. So you may see some connection between that information and what we're talking about today in terms of crisis communication. So just keep that in mind. And get the slides started here. Okay, so this coordinates with the part of Chapter 4, which is really short, about working with journalists and bloggers. It's just 2 pages. And then the Chapter 1, or the chapter that you read that was a PDF, that's from the Fern Banks book. It's a very popular book for crisis communication courses, so that's why I supplemented our tiny little piece from our textbook with it, because it's pretty relevant stuff. So there's 2 things that are really the constant when it comes to crisis communication. You want to aim always, always, always for the best messages delivered by the most effective means to the precise audience that you need to reach. Okay, you always are striving to be clear and correct, get the information to people the way they want it or the way they need it, and then specifically target whoever that audience is, whether it's news media, whether it's people who work for the organization, clients, that kind of thing. The second constant, and really the universal constant, is this idea of change. Change is the constant. Things are changing all the time in crisis communication. You really have to be able to adjust if you ever go into crisis communication. And I love studying it, but I do not love being in it, that's for sure. So how do you tell if it's a crisis? Well, there's a couple of things. There's this idea of it's a major occurrence, right? So it's a big deal. With a potentially negative outcome, not always negative. Sometimes things turn out a lot better than you think they are. I would say that's pretty rare. Affecting an organization and or its publics, its products, its services it delivers, or its good name. Okay, and one of the things that really constitutes a crisis is an interruption of the regular flow of operations. So something that's not normal, that's out of the norm, and it often includes things like a surprise incident, lack of information, people panic because they don't know, they don't have the information, a loss of control on the part of your organization, increased scrutiny. Sometimes something happens with your organization and then there's a federal investigation, heaven forbid. There also often has, internally especially, this kind of siege mentality. We're under siege. And which inevitably, large or small, leads to some kind of panic. So these components are pretty common when it comes to a crisis, and therefore crisis communication is really important, and planning about crisis communication is essential. And so those are a few things that we're going to talk about here today. Fern Banks has 5 stages of crisis. She talks about the idea of detection, prevention, preparation, containment, recovery, and learning. And as we go through today, we're not going to really focus on those so much, but if you ever go into studying crisis communication, these 5 stages are very, very clear when you're studying crisis situations. They're not always clear when you're in the moment, so understanding the stages may help you in terms of knowing how to respond. What also helps you is having a plan, and if you don't have one, you get one fast. There's also a second sort of rule or guideline when it comes to crisis communication. Tell everything you know and tell it fast. We'll talk more about these in just a couple of minutes. So the first idea of having a plan. Gotta have a plan. Simply put, if you don't have a plan, you're planning to fail. You want to make sure that a plan that you put together is fairly simple, fairly straightforward, and practical. You're not saying do something that you're not going to be able to do during a crisis situation. So you really want to make sure that you're being practical. It involves being created by the people who are going to use the plan. Part of that is to make sure that you understand it and you know how to use it. You've seen the information before, you've gone through this, that kind of thing. Also, a good plan makes sure that it has good, clear guidelines and directions for internal communication in the organization, who's in charge, who talks to the media, who doesn't talk to the media, all of those kinds of things. It prioritizes making sure that you're organized in terms of who you're talking to and how you're talking to people inside your organization. Also involves things like any necessary individuals or groups, ancillary people that maybe not inside your organization, but if you have a board of directors, is there information that they need? Do they need to provide any kinds of authorizations or anything like that? Great plans, good plans have guidelines for messages, key messages, and that's your assignment this week is to create some key messages. So we'll talk about that. And information about assistance, how to help people given different types of potential crisis situations. And then, as always, about media relations, making sure that you have a media contact list that's updated, and then an inclusion of media relationships with a lot of the basics. You'd be surprised at how many times during crisis situations people kind of panic and are under a siege feeling. And so having basic information in here is really, really handy. It really helps out rather than having to go searching for some of the basic information. So what else goes into the plan? You do want to make sure that you have sort of a history and even like an organizational chart about the organization that shows clearly who's in charge of what. Makes it easy to find the director of, manufacturing pretty quickly. You also make sure that you identify who are the key groups of people that we as an organization communicate with, and how do we communicate with them? Do we have an employee intranet and or a listserv, and is that how we communicate with internal employees, and how do we communicate with customers, and making sure that there's a documentation of a lot of the basics here. Again, who's on the team, what's their contact information. A lot of times what happens is one or two people get there first, and then how do you get everybody else in? Well, a lot of times there's a communication, like a call chain or a call tree or something like that. You also want to make sure that you clearly identify who your spokespersons are. You may not, you may have a general spokesperson and then identify potential spokespeople for different parts or different kinds of communication within your organization. You also want to have information on who are the emergency personnel in your area, or in the area that your organization operates. So if you have a corporate headquarters and then you have different plants around the country, you want to make sure that you have emergency personnel listed for each of those different plants or locations. Might sound funny, but a list of supplies and equipment for your crisis control room. Again, you want to make things as easy as possible. Run down the list, get these things, pull these things from the storeroom or whatever, make it really easy. A list of related websites with reference information that your organization tends to go to or use. having all of that in one place is I can't tell you how handy it can be. Obviously, you want to have key messages, and then any information that your team during the planning process thinks, hey, this is really important for us to include, and you need to go through that process and ask yourself, what else are we missing? What else do we need to have? Okay. So, a really tragic but great example of a crisis communication situation is the Texas A&M bonfire incident that happened in 1999. It's considered a textbook case. And I don't know if you're familiar with this. You may or may not have heard about this. But Texas A&M, I don't know if you've ever been there, but they have a very strong sense of tradition at that university. Lots and lots of traditions they have. In fact, I would say that's the number one thing. If you're a Texas A&M Aggie, tradition is your middle name. Up until the late 90s, early 2000s, they had this tradition of a bonfire during their week prior to the Texas A&M University of Texas Austin football game in the fall. And what they did was they built this student structure. You can see it here. It's the top picture of a 40-foot stack of logs, and student built every year. Very tradition oriented. And this year, in 1999, the structure collapsed as it was being built in the middle of the night, as you can see, 2:42 a.m. Rescue efforts took more than 24 hours, and the incident injured 27 people and killed 12 students. So it was a pretty big incident. This first video is a fairly long video. I encourage you to watch just the first 13 minutes. If you want to watch beyond that, you're more than welcome, because I do think it is interesting, especially if you're hoping to study more about crisis communication. But if you're thinking about the video, really think about what are the traditions, what are the cultural, standards when you watch the video. I'm also going to link a more complete explanation. It's again from the Fernbanks textbook about this incident, and part of why it was such a big deal. Yes, when you have a dozen people losing their lives and you have more than twice that being injured, it's very serious. But there were some things that happened along the communication continuum in terms of crisis communication that were not well handled. And so if you're interested in reading more, you can. I'll make sure that the slide has a link here, and that's linked in the modules for you to read more about or to scan. So in thinking about what do you do the first hour, you want to make sure you get in touch with everyone. Tell them where to be, tell them what to expect. Do they need to bring things? How long am I going to be here? Do I need to bring a change of clothes? Do you need to bring, are you potentially the spokesperson? Do you need to bring a set of clothes if you're on camera? Who else do I need to call? Is there anyone I need to bring in? And then you also start the process of documenting things. You want to make sure that you make notes of what happens and when. And then you also, hopefully in your plan, you've done some sort of sketching about where's your media center going to be, where are people going to come to when they need information, and who's in charge of that area. Also, you want to make sure that there is a plan for assigning people certain duties. What things do they absolutely need to take care of? Who's the spokesperson? Who's the representative on the scene? The second shift leader, the idea behind that is to make sure that you recognize, a human being cannot go 24/7. And so you have someone else who's going to, at some point, take over and give the first person a rest. You make sure that you understand who's in charge of the media center, who's going to coordinate the phone calls and the answering the phones and responding to phone and web, who's going to be doing some of the background, research and writing, who's going to monitor the news, and that's a really important element to make sure that you're monitoring what's being said. When you are in this first hour, you want to make sure you follow the plan. You don't allow anyone to stray from the plan, and that you are all working on the same team. You know who is going to respond to people on the phone. um, what they're going to say, what the sort of the shift scheduling is like, and then again, who's going to do the documentation. And then that last thing you want to make sure that you do is schedule a media briefing. A lot of times you want to give yourself some time between that first hour and the media briefing, if at all possible. But since we've already discussed issuing media advisories, you know what that process looks like. So here's our second guideline, our second rule, which is tell everything and tell it as soon as you can. Consistency is the name of the game. You want to make sure that you're giving out one consistent message in a consistent voice. You're accurate, you're consistent. If you need to have more than one person speaking, who's the expert? Is that person able to handle the stress of the situation? Have they been trained? Have they been media trained? Are they a person who can think quickly on their feet? Are they a clear thinker? Or are they fatigued from the crisis situation? If that's the case, you might need to choose someone else. Again, this idea of speaking with one voice, you need to make sure that you understand possible questions that you'll receive. What are your key messages? And you focus on those key messages, and then you support and back that up with factual information. I'm going to talk here in a little bit about key messages, and then also this idea of bridging back to key messages from questions. You also want to make sure that you are in pretty quick connection with your legal counsel and liability information. Somebody's aware of at least working on that. Some things to think about in terms of spokespersons, and this goes along with our media relations and what you do and don't say in talking to media. You want to make sure that you're not pushed into something, that you don't lose your temper, that you don't let stress get to you. Sorry about that. That you don't let stress get to you, that you don't say no comment, that you don't speculate about what could or couldn't happen. You also want to make sure that you don't really don't obscure blame, that you don't talk about blame, that all of those kinds of things, that you really think carefully. Making sure that you express we are concerned about those affected. We don't know might be hard to say, but we'll work to find out and tell you is a very honest, forthright way of being. It's okay to say that you don't know, but you've got to follow that up with we are working to find out, and as soon as we have information on that, we will share with you. When there is uncertainty, as much as possible, you want to say we are uncertain about this. We don't have all the facts yet. The situation's evolving. Being open and honest is the best way to go here, and it can be very painful because it is a crisis situation, but that's something that you really want to make sure that you do, that you are as honest as possible. In making your first statement, I have that image here of the Boston Marathon bombing, and I'll link the video again just in case you want to have a look at it again. But even if you feel like you don't have very much information to share after that first hour or a couple of hours in your media advisory or in your media conference, you want to be compassionate. You also want to say what you don't know. You want to say what you're doing about it. This is what we're doing. Show the effort that your organization is going to control or respond to the situation. And this is really the main reason I included the image of the Boston Marathon bombing conference was, remember, in this press conference, they talked about what people should do. They gave safety messages. This is what you should do if you're from out of town. Go to your hotel and stay in your hotel because we're not sure the danger is over. So there's two videos here about what not to do in media interviews. Some great examples of gaffes, things that weren't thought through, people that were not prepared, and some top interview mistakes for you to watch and be familiar with. These will be really important when you're considering creating your key messages. You want to make sure that you don't make your person, whoever your spokesperson is, run into any of these problems. So you really do need to watch those videos. When you have an unexpected request for information, whether it's a question catches you off guard, don't answer if you don't know or you're not prepared to talk about that. Don't answer. Um, Especially if someone calls in, find out what their topic is, find out what their deadline is, then talk to your communication team, do some brainstorming. What are potential questions? What are our potential answers? Do your research before oh my gosh, before you identify who's going to answer, who's going to be your spokesperson. Then when you develop your key messages and what information you're going to include, then you call back as you promised the person who called with that unexpected request. So typical questions. There's 6 types of typical questions. You'll notice here the who, what, where, when, why, and how. What happened? Why? How did it happen? How much is it going to cost? That's a big one. And cost isn't always financial. Keep in mind, this has to do with people's lives and injuries and things like that. Where did it happen and when? And then always, 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 who is responsible? Who is to blame? Not preparing for answers to these questions is preparing to fail. So keep in mind that those are the 6 really, really typical important questions for you to prepare for. In creating key messages, one of the fundamental principles is know what your message is and be able to say it in different ways with different words. When you're delivering key messages, you want to make sure that you're inspiring confidence and control and that you're also being sincere. If you watch this video, it starts at about 7:25 and you watch till about 11 minutes. This is a situation where there was a fire in a Rhode Island nightclub and people died as a result. When you watch, think about what were the key messages and how you could tell what the key messages were. And then I think another thing that's really interesting is there's 2 men interviewed. What did the 2 men do differently? How are their reactions different? How are their answers different? So think about those things. Something to make sure that you're aware of and careful about is that when you use key messages, sometimes it's tempting to use them to avoid answering a difficult question. You absolutely do not want to do that. You want to make sure that you have appropriate responses to questions. It makes the situation worse when you use a key message that doesn't answer the question. You look like you're avoiding communicating clearly and honestly, and you don't want to do that. There's another technique when you get questions. The idea is to acknowledge the question, answer it briefly, and then return to your key message. So there's a link here about what bridging is and how you do it. This is also going to be key for you to watch and develop responses for your assignment for the week. So make sure that you watch this video. A couple more things to think about in key messages. You want to make sure that they're fairly short, that they're soundbite size. You want to make sure that that it can be used for a soundbite or a pull quote in a news article that's digital, that's typed. You also want to make sure that the values of your organization and what your organization is really about is reflected in your key messages. So if your organization is really focused on fiscal responsibility, that's something that's a part of your mission or something like that, you want to make sure that that's reflected some way in your key messages, as long as it's appropriate. You also want to make sure that you do not speculate. What you know only. Do not, hypothesize or try and see into the future. That gets you into tons of trouble. The other thing about key messages, you want to make sure you back them up with facts. So if you say you're taking this very seriously, you want to be able to prove that. You want to say we're taking this very seriously, and so we've pulled together experts who are going to investigate. We're also recalling the product that was, problematic or something like that. So you want to make the statement, but then you want to back it up with actions, a description of actions that are very concrete, that people can see you are doing what you said you were going to do. So 3 examples that you want to take a look at of different crisis communication plans, and in each one of them there are little samples of key messages for you to kind of use to craft your own key messages. So give yourself a little practice. If you're the PR county, if you're the PR director of County Bank, a VP in the organization discovers that customer data has been stolen. You, as the PR director, learn about it, though, from a reporter's call, and so the reporter wants to break the story within the hour. Okay? So what are the first things that you do? What questions should you anticipate? And then what are 1 to 3 key messages that the bank should share in response? And who should be the person that shares them? Okay, so you might want to think about, what's the established protocol? Who do we talk to? And then who do you notify first? And then speak to the reporter, or speak to the VP that the reporter spoke to or learned this from. Questions? Look back at those 6 questions. A lot of times they're going to start with what happened, who's at fault, how's it going to impact customers, and then what's the organization doing to address the problem. Thinking about key messages, well, here at County Bank, customer privacy is key. Our focus is on how did this happen and what can we do to prevent this in the future. Okay? So some reminders to think about: never, never, never mislead. Make sure that when you're responding to inquiries, news inquiries or media inquiries, and at news conferences, that you are summarizing information and then providing details and facts. You want to use your key message a few times, up to 3 times, just to reiterate. It is always best to do a face-to-face news conference and or interview. Also, reinforce the information that you share either in the interview or in the face-to-face or whatever in writing. Issue a fact sheet or news release afterwards. We talked about on the record, off the record. Don't go off the record. There is no such thing as no comment. Do not use it. And then again, I know I've said this, but do not speculate. So, when the news is really bad, when the news is bad in general, you want to monitor the coverage. There is a link here of an option of a product to keep track of published stories. A simple way to do this now is Google Alerts. Using that process is really handy. Anytime anything gets posted to the web, a Google Alert will catch it. Making sure that any errors are corrected, and then you've identified priority audiences. Who are the people who are your priority that you as the organization communicate with? You also want to make sure that you understand a crisis isn't forgotten when the immediate danger has passed. Crises can stretch into years. If you think about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, that was in, 2010? We're still hearing about it, and not just in crisis communication lectures. Also be aware that anniversaries do renew the incident. Think about the anniversary of 9/11 every year, but a 10-year anniversary is a big deal, and I anticipate that in coming years, anniversaries of that particular crisis will renew feelings, and so you need to be aware of that when you work for an organization. Even when the crisis itself is over, the incident is over, be aware that it's not always gone. Okay? So thinking about the Texas A&M bonfire incident, and this is a great example of how anniversaries come up. In 2008 was the resolution of the final lawsuit related to the crisis. It consumed students, faculty, everybody involved on campus for months. Since 1999, the traditional bonfire has stopped. Students began bonfires off campus in 2002. I'm not aware if those still continue. I would certainly hope that they don't, just given some of the problematic things that go into the whole idea of a massive bonfire. Communicators still have to deal with this at Texas A&M University. Each November, they have an anniversary. There is a memorial on campus, and it's the bottom image here. And then at the 10-year anniversary, so that was 2009, There was a video put together. You might check that out and look at the images that are used and what happened. You can really see the depth and breadth of the crisis situation. So if you work at Texas A&M in any kind of communication capacity, this is something that you have to deal with and be aware of every year. Okay? All right. So that's the end of the slideshow here. Make sure that you go back and view the videos. And those things will help you for your assignment for the week. Okay?